Well, it's a beautiful fall day here in central Nebraska, but around here, that can change pretty quickly. And we rely a lot on local weather forecasts when it comes to planning our outdoor activities. Where does all that forecast information come from? Well, a lot of it starts off with the information that's gathered by weather balloons. Not the balloon specifically, but the device that's attached to it. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, so the weather balloon itself is a specially made latex balloon, and when this thing is inflated on the ground, it's about 6 feet in diameter. But by the time this thing rises up to its final altitude before it pops or bursts, it's about the size of a two-car garage. It's about 24, 25 feet in diameter when it finally bursts. What causes it to pop? So here's what happens. Let's call this ground. And on the ground, we have our balloon, and we fill that balloon with hydrogen gas. Symbol for hydrogen, H2. So we fill this full of hydrogen, we tie this off to seal it so the gas doesn't escape. So we have all these little hydrogen molecules in here, and they're lighter than air, so they want to pull that balloon and whatever's connected to it up. Now, on the ground, air molecules, for the sake of this argument, are all tightly packed together. Let's say they're packed together like a snowball. But the higher you go in altitude, the less dense they are. So they start to expand. They take up more space. So those same molecules at, let's just pick a number, at 10,000 feet versus 1,800 feet where we're at, those air molecules, the same quantity of air molecules will take up more space, so that it's less dense, so we call that thinner air. And as this rises, as it goes up in altitude, the higher and higher it gets, the pressure on the outside of the balloon is less and less. So with this being sealed, it almost acts like somebody's blowing up a balloon. It gradually grows as it goes up in altitude. And these things usually pop at around 100,000 feet, which is like 20 miles above the surface. So once the balloon pops, there's a small parachute that's attached to the radio sonde that helps slow its descent as it heads towards the ground. Now these balloons are launched by the National Weather Service twice a day, every day, from over 90 locations across the country. Those launch times are synchronized so that everybody launches their balloons at the same time. The times that those are actually launched are at 0 or midnight and 12 o'clock Universal Coordinated Time. Now here in Nebraska, that time, this time of year, when there's no daylight saving time, is 6 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock at night. I think it's important to remember that these balloons get launched regardless of the weather conditions. And it's not always just no wind and all nice and sunny out. This particular launch was done in the middle of a blizzard in January of 2021, about 100 miles from here in Omaha, Nebraska. Here's another example, about 100 miles the other side of us at North Platte, Nebraska. Like I mentioned early in the video, the balloon is not actually sending us any kind of data. The balloon is just the vehicle that they use to transport the little package that does all the measurements that's called a radio sonde. So let's take a look at one. Okay, let's get to the bottom of this. This is an actual radio sonde. And let me explain a few things that you see here. This is a very accurate temperature measurement device right out here on the end. This is for measuring the air temperature. This is a hygrometer that measures the humidity in the air, the moisture content of the air. Inside the box, there's a barometric pressure sensor, so we get the pressure of the air at those particular altitudes. There is also a GPS receiver. The GPS receiver tells them in the information that's being sent where the box is. It gives them the latitude and longitude where it's located over the ground. It also gives them the altitude. It gives them vertical speed, whether it's going up and down and how fast. It gives them horizontal speed, so the speed across ground. And that's how they determine the the wind direction and speed. So if the package is moving to the north at 20 miles an hour, they know the wind at that particular altitude is 20 miles an hour out of the north.
Okay, hold on 1 minute here. Where did that guy get his information? If we have a radio sonde and it's moving to the north at 20 miles an hour, that means that the wind has to be out of the south at 20 miles an hour, not out of the north at 20 miles an hour. Come on.
So that's pretty much the box as is. This one was launched way back in April of 2019 from the North Platte Weather Service, which is about 100 miles west of here. They include a little bag, a little mailer, so that if you find one of these, you can send it back. You don't have to, but if you want to send it back, at no cost to you, they'll refurbish it and put it back in use. Now, if we peel back the layers a little bit, we can see what one of these looks like on the inside. Now, this little cable hanging off the end here, this is a power supply that I put on there so that I could run some experiments on it. But essentially, it's one circuit board. We have where the batteries were. Again, the hygrometer, the temperature measurement device. This is the barometric pressure sensor. I'm assuming because it's on top of the board that this is probably the GPS receiver antenna because it needs to be able to see the satellites. On the bottom, this is another antenna here. I'm assuming that is the transmitter antenna, the radio transmitter antenna, where they get the information transmitted from back to the Weather Service, and then all the support electronics that go along with it. So essentially, that's what all this balloon business is about, is getting information from this back to the Weather Service, qualify the data, and then get that stuffed into those models so that they can have up-to-date information to be able to give us better forecasts. Okay, now you've seen how the pros do it, it's my turn. Now we're going to talk about my journey that lasted probably about 10 years and got me involved in what is known as ARHAB, or ARAHB, Amateur Radio High Altitude Ballooning. About 20 years ago, I read an article on the internet about these guys from Michigan that had launched their own weather balloon. And I thought, hey, I could launch my own weather balloon and take some of my custom-built electronics and have it haul it up to the stratosphere. I could collect my own data, take some pictures, maybe even take some video. It'd be like my own little space program. Well, technically it's near space, but that's beside the point. Anyway, I'm going to take you on a journey that will hopefully give you an idea of what I went through and some of the fun that I had along the way and some of the problems we had along the way. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about amateur radio high altitude ballooning. So I started to do my research. I was able to get answers to several of the questions right away, like, is it legal? The short answer is yes. It's governed by Federal Aviation Regulation, Title 14, Chapter 1, Subchapter F, Part 101. And if you want to launch your own weather balloon, I suggest you read this. Let's see. Where do you buy weather balloons? Well, it turns out you can buy them from the same company that supplies them to the National Weather Service. And yes, there are different sizes. The size that you need is dictated by how heavy the payload is you want to lift and how high you want it to go. That leads me right into the next question, which is how much helium? Now, if you'll remember, I said that the National Weather Service uses hydrogen. My assumption is that they use hydrogen because it's cheaper, more plentiful, and it's also lighter than helium. The big difference for me was hydrogen is flammable slash explosive, and helium is not. Helium is an inert gas. Helium's more expensive, but it's also much safer. In these days, current times, helium is kind of hard to come by, and a lot of the groups that I'm familiar with have converted to hydrogen. But for me, in the time that I spent doing this, I always used helium. How much helium? Well, we were hoping to achieve the same altitude that the National Weather Service does with their balloons and try to make it to 100,000 feet. I don't believe any of my flights ever made it to 100,000. I think most of them ended up in the 90-some thousand feet range, but still up there a ways. And the amount of helium you put in also dictates the ascent rate. We always tried to make it around 1,000 feet per minute. And that way it took about an hour and a half or 90 minutes to get to burst altitude. So that being said, that answered most of the questions right away. But you have to remember that the internet was relatively young at that time. Heck, YouTube wasn't even a thing yet. I found some websites with regards to groups that were launching their own weather balloons. I also used the one that I originally found from the guys in Michigan. I got a few tidbits of information from them. And one of the key things that I learned was, how do you track these things? Well, most of these groups were using amateur radio modes. And that's where this question is going to take a much lengthier explanation. I had to learn all about amateur radio. I had to get licensed, and I also had to build some things and test some things in order to even have the infrastructure to be able to track my very own weather balloon. So I started researching amateur radio. First of all, the terms amateur radio and ham radio are used interchangeably. I'll let you do your own research and where the term ham radio came from. As an adult, I thought amateur radio was just a glorified version of CB or citizens band radio like we used to use back in the 1970s, but that wasn't the case. I discovered that the government had allocated certain sections of the radio frequency spectrum specifically to amateur radio operators for the purpose of non-commercial exchange of messages, wireless experimentation, private recreation, contesting, and emergency communication. And all of this was available to anyone that was able to pass a written test and pay a small fee to get a license. The test covers basic electronics, radio equipment, antennas, radio propagation, RF safety, and the radio regulations of the government granting the license. I found a local ham radio club, studied for my test, and in February of 2002 became a licensed amateur radio operator and was issued call sign KC0MWM. Yep, just like the TV and radio stations, every amateur radio station is given its own unique call sign, and that one is mine. And it's not just everyday people that become hams. There are also a few famous people like Joe Walsh from the musical group The Eagles, country singer Patty Loveless, the late Chet Atkins, and the former King of Jordan, King Hussein, to name a few. Ham radio has been part of the storyline in the television series Last Man Standing. Tim Allen, who plays the main character of the show, was inspired by the show's storyline and earned his ham radio license. One of the largest uses for amateur radio is for emergency communication. It has consistently been the most reliable means of communication during emergencies when other forms of communication have failed or been overloaded. For example, on 9/11, following the terrorist attacks, ham radio operators were on the air, communicating within minutes, and provided essential public service communication for several agencies for weeks to come. Because of the resilient nature of amateur radio, someone came up with the quote, "When all else fails, amateur radio." It is truly the backup communication plan for so many things. Even the International Space Station. Their backup communication plan is ham radio. And most of the astronauts that have occupied the space station are licensed amateur radio operators. Occasionally, when one of the astronauts has some free time, you might hear them on the air talking to other ham radio operators on Earth. I was fortunate enough to make a contact with one of them. I got the chance to speak briefly with Commander Doug Wheelock back in 2010. Sometime later, I received a QSL card, or confirmation of our contact, in the mail. Pretty cool. There are a lot of ways you can use amateur radio to communicate. There are voice modes, image modes, text modes, and data modes. Probably one of the most familiar digital modes to most people is Morse code. Some of the earliest versions of Morse code date back almost 200 years. For tracking weather balloons, I found that most groups in the US were using a digital mode called APRS, which stands for Amateur Packet Reporting System. APRS can take GPS location information and transmit those packets to APRS receiving stations, which can then show the location on a map. One of the advantages of APRS is there is a network of receiving stations operating on a common frequency in most populated areas. Each of those stations are managed or controlled by an amateur radio operator. Most of those receiving stations are one of two types. One common type of receiving station is a digital repeater, or digipeater. This type of station receives APRS signals and then retransmits it for others to receive. Usually, digipeaters are located on tall towers or higher elevations so that more distant stations can easily receive their transmissions. Another type of receiving station is an Internet Gateway, or iGate. These stations have a connection to the Internet. They receive the APRS radio signal and pass it along to the APRS Internet service that makes these packets available to various online sources. So there are lots of APRS stations in most of the heavily populated areas. Unfortunately, where I live in the middle of Nebraska, there wasn't a single one. That meant that I would need to figure out how to put together my own internet gateway to receive signals and get them so they would be visible on the internet, and also put together a small APRS transmitter that could be carried by the weather balloon. It was time to start building stuff. I put together a radio, antenna, computer, and this thing called a TNC, or Terminal Node Controller. It was basically the piece of hardware that translated the data between the radio and the computer. And all these things had their own special configuration that needed to be done, and I knew almost nothing about it. I had the same issues to work through when it came to put together the device for tracking that was going to be in the balloon payload. I got the iGate up and running, and then got the transmitter for the balloon payload up and running. Now it was time to test it. My first few tests, nothing was being shown on the receiving station. This presented kind of a unique problem. You see, with no other APRS stations in our area, I was trying to figure out if it was the receiving station, the transmitting station, or a problem with both. After enough trial and error, I finally got everything working and officially put the first APRS station on the air in my area. Hooray! One of the next things I needed to figure out was what to make the payload container out of. It needed to be lightweight, it needed to be able to insulate the electronic devices inside because it gets extremely cold at those high altitudes. Back when I was studying to get my private pilot's license and I was learning about weather and forecasts, one of the things that I learned was that above 24,000 feet, it's always below freezing, no matter what time of year. What I didn't know is that it gets more than twice that cold as you get higher. More on that later. While I was trying to sort out all the details from my payload container and electronic gear, I discovered that there was another individual here in Nebraska that was already involved in this hobby and had been doing it for several years. I connected with Mark Connor from the group NSTAR, or Nebraska Stratospheric Amateur Radio. Mark lived near Omaha, so we stayed in contact via email, and he became my mentor. Mark's solution for the payload container was simple: a soft-sided lunch cooler. It was certainly much easier than assembling something from styrofoam or foam board like some of the other groups were doing. I opted for Mark's solution. He also mentioned that I invest in some lithium batteries to power the payload and not use standard alkaline batteries. The reason for this is that the voltage of alkaline batteries quickly drops off as the battery gets colder. And even though the payload container is insulated, it still gets very cold on the inside. Lithium batteries, because of the chemistry, aren't affected by the cold temperatures as much. One of my main goals on the first flight was to take some aerial photos from those high altitudes. Now, back then, digital cameras were relatively new, and they didn't have many of the features like the ones we have now. Like the ability to automatically take a photo every so many seconds. What I ended up doing was finding a relatively inexpensive digital camera, brought it home, made sure it worked like it was supposed to, and then promptly voided the warranty. I tore into it so that I could make some modifications. I needed to be able to trigger the focus and shutter from my own microprocessor. The processor I chose was the Basic Stamp from the Parallax company. It was popular with electronic hobbyists back then. After a little experimentation with the hardware and multiple versions of the program, I finally had a payload that would take a photo every minute, in addition to transmitting its location so that we could track it, hopefully. Now all I needed was a balloon, some helium, and a catchy name for my project. I never did come up with a catchy name or any cool acronym like NSTAR. I settled for CNNSP, the Central Nebraska Near Space Program. And as you can see, I'm not an art major. So this was my official logo. Okay, back to that first flight. Mark had suggested that for the first flight of my payload, it might be a good idea to fly it along with a known good payload in case there were any unforeseen problems with my tracker. He offered to supply a balloon, and I would supply the helium, so we set a date, May 30th, 2005, and chose a location for the launch. Several days before the launch, we started running landing predictions based on the launch site that we had chosen. Yes, even 20 years ago, you could predict with a reasonable degree of accuracy where the balloon should land. Back then, we used a program for predictions that was written for Windows, based on some program code that was initially created by Bill Brown, the gentleman that flew the first amateur radio high-altitude balloon, and has become known as the father of amateur radio high-altitude ballooning. We would feed the most recent upper air sounding data from the National Weather Service into the program, along with the estimated average ascent and descent speed, and of course the launch location. It would then generate a flight profile and an estimated landing position. All of this much easier today because there are online prediction sites that have been developed by other interested hobbyists. One of the things we try to avoid is having the payloads land in a populated area or close to a roadway with lots of traffic. Occasionally, the launch location needs to change based on the predicted landing area. As the launch day got closer, I was getting nervous and excited for my first flight. That day finally came, and we met at the launch site on a Saturday morning. We needed to get an early start because as the sun rises, typically, so does the wind speed. And these balloons are like giant kites, and the slightest wind tends to make them hard to handle. So, The less wind for filling and launching, the better. Mark and his team did a great job of showing us how to get the balloon filled and prepped for flight. Once we accomplished that, we did a final check of the payloads to make sure everything was operational, and then I was given the opportunity to let it go and initiate the flight. It was kind of a surreal experience to watch my many months of hard work and planning climbing up and out of sight. We packed up our gear and got underway. We stopped several miles short of the predicted landing site to wait for the balloon to burst and monitor its descent. The first flight of my APRS tracker was going well until we got down to around 28,000 feet. At that point, I stopped getting telemetry updates on my laptop. I immediately started to try to figure out what was wrong. I could hear the data being sent, but nothing was being decoded on my receiving station. Fortunately, I listened to Mark and followed his advice to fly my first flight with a known good tracker. Thanks to his reliable tracker, we were able to follow the payloads to their landing site, and as a bonus, we were able to be in position to watch the payloads descend under the parachute during the last several seconds of the flight. That was all thanks to Mark's experience. Once we recovered our payloads, we stopped to get some lunch, and I was discussing my tracker's failure with Wayne, one of Mark's friends. Wayne's also a ham and is very knowledgeable in APRS and packet radio. He made a recommendation to me about changing a setting on my tracker that he thought was the likely culprit. With the first flight under my belt and some changes made to the payload electronics, I was anxious to fly again. But I was also a little nervous as to whether the suggested changes to the tracker would make it 100% reliable.
Let's take a quick look at some of the data from that first flight. This is the chart showing the altitude and the temperature. If you look at the two spots that I have marked with red circles, you'll notice that the temperature, the light blue line, was headed down, 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 and then all of a sudden, about that point that I have marked, the temperature turns around and starts to warm back up. That's an indication that you're entering the stratosphere, and on this chart, that's about 42,000 feet. So I've highlighted a couple of numbers here. One of them being the highest altitude that we achieved, or at least recorded, and that's the 91,611 feet. And the other number is the 79 miles an hour that the payload was traveling, and that means that the wind at that altitude, which was around 40,000 feet, was that speed.
Mark told me about an annual event for high-altitude ballooners known as GPSL, the Great Plains Super Launch, which started in 2001. It's a two-day event with a symposium on Friday and a group launch on Saturday. The 2005 GPSL was being hosted by him and his group in Omaha and was only 2 months away. I planned to attend the event, and we agreed to share another balloon and fly together again. The launch site chosen was a small town in western Iowa, so we could avoid flying over the Omaha metro area. There were several balloon groups from across the country in attendance. We had groups from Colorado, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Idaho, Indiana, and even one from New York. It was a nice calm morning for filling balloons, and most of the groups were able to launch simultaneously. As soon as we did, Mark noticed that he was not receiving any data from his tracker. He had been preoccupied with all the coordination with other groups. He had forgotten to connect the power to his tracker. He looked at me and said, "Well, it's all up to you." Fortunately, the changes I made to my tracker corrected the issue we had during the last flight, and we were able to track our payloads to the landing position, to the middle of a cornfield, which should be expected because in this part of the country, there's a lot of corn. After 2 flights with Mark, it seemed that I had the bugs worked out of my tracker, so I figured it was time to attempt a flight without my mentor. I was able to talk a few friends from our local ham radio club into participating, and one of them, Jack Barnard, even offered to build a backup tracker for the upcoming flight. I made the decision to launch from a small town high school just west of us. As we were making our pre-launch preparations, we started to get a few spectators. I had contacted one of the science teachers from the school about launching from their parking lot, and he put the word out to the students. It was a little stressful not having the experience of Mark and his group with us, but we managed to get the balloon filled, the payloads checked out, and all of it launched in a reasonable amount of time. We packed up and headed down the road towards the predicted landing area. The last prediction showed the landing about 70 miles downrange. Fortunately, it didn't end up being quite that far. Our descent rate was a bit faster than expected, and that shortened the distance about 30 miles. The last airborne packet we received showed it just over the small town of Sutton. So we headed towards that location so we could hopefully receive another signal to show us its actual position. As we got into town, we received an update location and drove towards the signal. Landing in town in a residential area had me a bit nervous because there are too many things in a populated area for the payloads to hit, and none of them good. As we turned a corner, we all spotted the payloads and parachute at the same time, on the top of someone's garage. The owner was a nice lady and even let us use her ladder to get on the roof to retrieve our gear. In 2007, we hosted the Great Plains Super Launch here in Grand Island. I didn't fly anything because I was too busy trying to coordinate everything. But we had a great turnout. Many of the groups presented on their latest projects, and we had 11 groups from 9 states launch balloons.
We flew a total of 11 times over a span of 11 years. We got to fly for a couple of special events like the Central Plains Severe Weather Symposium in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Watch out! Okay.
And our last flight was for the Edgerton Explore It Center in Aurora, Nebraska. This one was especially fun because my son and grandchildren came out to give us a hand with the launch. This hobby has been very rewarding. It gave me the opportunity to design and build several different APRS trackers and data loggers, and then test them in a unique environment. I met some very kind, very intelligent people along the way, made some new friends, and have a lot of memorable experiences. I won't say I'm finished with this hobby, but maybe just ending this chapter. As my grandchildren get older, if they have any interest in exploring the reaches of near space, I'd be happy to launch another balloon to support their experiments. Also, I've been doing a little work on something that a few other groups around the world have already tackled, and they're calling them pico balloons. You design and build an extremely lightweight tracker that's solar powered, and then send it aloft using a 36-inch Mylar party balloon or something similar. By getting the balloon to float around the 30,000-foot altitude, you can circumnavigate the globe. Technology continues to evolve, and towards the end of my little balloon journey, the photos and video drastically improved. By our last flight in 2016, high-resolution video was affordable enough for me to capture some pretty cool photos and video. With that, I'll leave you with some of the sights and sounds of our balloon flights. So thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to click that thumbs up icon. See you next time.